is the question of the day. History has shown that non-African visitors have found it easier to travel within Africa than Africans themselves. It can be up to 50% cheaper to fly from Africa to Europe or from the United Arab Emirates than to fly within the African continent. Studies show that African countries turn to trade more with countries outside the continent than with each other. These situations have sparked discussions and even jokes about human mobility within the African continent, highlighting factors like protectionism, policies by African states that restrict travel. But the continent is making progress towards a borderless Africa inspired by the African Union's ideals to increase intra-continental trade and promote the free movement of people, aiming to boost socio-economic and political development. As of now, only 28% of African routes allowed Africans to travel visa-free by 2023, according to Visa Openness in Africa report from this same year, 2023. Countries like Seychelles, Benin, Gambia and Rwanda have so far abolished visa requirements for all Africans as these seek to capitalize on the market of over 1.2 billion people to expand their said economies. Understanding today's concept of a borderless Africa, join the conversation this day, ladies and gentlemen, as we unpack this with our expert. Thank you for joining us. Stay with us. Thank you for joining us this day. I'm Bote Africa. Thank you. It is a pleasure to be with you on this edition of Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa, and of course to discuss the concept of a borderless Africa, a pathway to integration. Ladies and gentlemen, we discuss this topic of discussion with our guest, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. Thank you immensely, sir. You're Pan-Africanist and equally an economist. Thank you for taking our time to be with us on this edition of Talking Point.
Thank you so much for having me, Sharon, and thank those who are joining us on our platforms, streaming platforms, and watching television as well.
Absolutely. And while we advocate for a united continent, while we advocate for a continent free of borders, free of troubles, of course, it is imperative for us to note that a borderless Africa will be one that is going to lead to economic growth, economic developments, and definitely prosperity. So, Dr. FONGOD, in a bit to kickstart today's conversation, of what importance as a Pan-Africanist it is for Africa to be without borders.
If we're going to have any Africa without borders, to have a continent that is borderless, that is a Pan-African utopia. It is the most beautiful thing, you know, to a Pan-African. And the reason for that is because Pan-Africanism is based upon Africa's unity. And this unity, first of all, needs to be realized on the African continent when the whole entire continent becomes one, so that we do not have so-called international borders on the African continent. And the second front, you know, of Pan-Africanism would be to unite the black peoples that are scattered all across the world. I'm talking about the Africans that are in the diaspora, and to merge that with the Africans that are on the continent. So a borderless Africa is absolutely a beautiful thing to a Pan-African.
Absolutely. While we talk about the beauty of Africa coming together as one people, it's imperative to note that Africans, first of all, need to see themselves as the brother's keeper, as one people first, for this concept to become a reality. That is the one of a one Africa reality. Now, in your perspective, of what importance or what role can political will actually play as far as bringing together the African continent is concerned, one that could be regarded as one that is without these borders that seem to be creating division within the continent?
I think there are probably 2 or 3 things that, you know, should be able to happen on the political front. There has to be a commitment to a Pan-African front, and this commitment must come as a result of the fact that most leaders that we elect on the African continent must have a Pan-African vision. It is no longer enough that someone who comes into power has the vision for the sovereign nation, but that the unity of the continent will have to outweigh every sovereignty. That we have to find ways to understand that the boundaries we have were superimposed not by Africans but by Europeans, and that's why these boundaries cut across strategic areas on the continent of Africa. It cuts across peoples, and it's absolutely quite disgraceful that you have communities that have been somewhat split on political fronts based upon international boundaries. Just walk or take a drive across all of our African Africa boundaries, you will discover that you're actually cutting through ancient communities. These are communities that have been in these areas for thousands of years. We have to create a policy on the African continent that literally mirror each other. We have talked about this in the past, where one country's political framework, economic framework, framework in the sectors of agriculture, and education. These sectors must kind of create some kind of a harmony across the continent. In that way, it will be easier, for example, someone who is trained as a medical doctor in Nigeria to be able to work in any African country, because there is that standardization that has been achieved by a single board on the African continent that administers these exams, so that by the time someone graduates from a university in Nigeria or a university in Cameroon or in the Gabons or a university in South Africa, we are not in great confusion as to what level or standard of education that they have. So we have to be able to create some kind of an accreditation, for all of our schools, so that once someone graduates, especially in engineering, or technology, medicine, we need to be able to give those people the priority to work anywhere else on the African continent where they seem fit, rather than the constant flight of our skilled workers out of the continent of Africa, which does the continent no good. So we need to be able to create that, and that's one of the ways in which we should be able, to achieve a borderless Africa. And I think that communities like ECOWAS, communities, like the African Union, needs to be able to fully understand this, integrate this, and then maybe, we have always talked about this on this, channel, maybe we go block by block. Maybe the Western Bloc basically puts our act together and create a Western community like the ECOWAS, create a community that's quite robust. In that way, there is freedom of goods and services, and then we do so on the Eastern Bloc and then the Southern Bloc. I'm sure if that's done, then we all on the African continent should be able to enjoy at least somewhat of a seamless, borderless Africa.
Absolutely, it's all about trying to foster for the growth of the African people, and definitely the African continent. Now you elaborated on the use, or say the role of education as far as advocating for borderless Africa is concerned. Now, when we get back to history, back when Africa, before the scramble of the African continent, Africa was actually one. But then, looking at history, looking at this contemporary society in which we find ourselves as of now, of what importance, or I say Africans, especially the youth that might have little or no knowledge about, say, the past of what happened before the continent actually had the same, these borders which we see in today's history. Do you think that revisiting Africa's history, getting back to the roots, getting back to the original culture of the African people, it's going to, say, create a part, a channel, a route that is actually going to play a very key role as far as eradicating these seamless borders and, of course, fostering unity and integration on the African continent?
I think that, for us to fully understand exactly this question, we need to look a little bit at two examples I'm going to give, the country of Cameroon and that of Nigeria. If you realize that for Cameroon, and I'm using Cameroon to be a purely, a francophone nation for this, in this particular example, just so that I can be able to kind of state my case a little bit more accurately. If you look at Nigeria to be an Anglo-Saxon platform, so if you look at Nigeria, for example, her point of reference on the African continent is not another African continent. Her point of reference on the African continent is the UK. So everything that Nigeria does in her consciousness, how big
it will link to the former colonial master.
Doing it. The point of consciousness is actually the UK. So and what that means is that they have been influenced tremendously in relationship to her culture, you know, by whatever is happening in England. So every single thing else about them, it's not, you know, especially when it has to do with something that is happening outside of Nigeria, you have to start talking or, you know, referencing London for whatever utopia that the average Nigerian is thinking about. If you show up in Cameroon, it's the same thing. The average point of reference for a regular French-speaking Cameroonian is not Nigeria, it's not South Africa, it's actually France. So you realize that most Cameroonians have moved to France because that's the utopia that they dream of. Likewise, in Nigeria, most Nigerians have actually moved out of Nigeria into the UK. I know of Nigerians that are working in the UK that used to be nurses in Nigeria, but they are actually working now as nurses in the UK. So if you look at that from that perspective, and this has come as a result, and these are the effects of the colonial era. So we were told when the colonial structures were firmly placed on the African continent that those nations were our point of reference. Every single thing else we did because of whatever, you know, those who had been our colonial masters told us that that's how we're supposed to do things. Our cultures have literally, been totally affected as a result. We are not, our cultures are not really that pure anymore. We are kind of evolving, but we're evolving, losing a lot of our own cultural heritage, and we're incorporating all the forms that is really not us. And so in regards to that, I think that we need to be able to focus a little bit on the continent of Africa, especially when it comes to education, to realize that Africa is equally just as great as any of these foreign zones, and also to let the African understand that the barriers that has come as a result of language is extremely artificial. It has nothing to do with who we are as a people. I think that across the continent of Africa, we have to literally attack one particular element that will help us emerge, and that's that is the part of language. If we do not take care of our language, as long as we continue to allow the English language and the French language to become, you know, the official language on the continent of Africa, that will tremendously, you know, put us in the position that we will be extremely limited. You don't see that happening in Russia. You don't see that happening, you know, in China. You don't see that happening in the United States. You don't see that happening, you know, in the UK. So we need to be able, long before we start talking about creating, diversity on the continent of Africa, we need first of all to understand exactly what our own cultural identification will be. Let us start by our language. I think we need to be able to employ, you know, languages like Swahili, to be able to help us, you know, fully encapsulate our cultures and allow every young African to know who we are as a people. Let our history be told from an Afrocentric perspective by Africans, not that our point of reference on the African continent should be Europe or the Americas.
Absolutely, the point of reference should definitely be the African continent. Now, you said something about language. I think it's a very key point, because even at the level of the African Union, the languages, there are the French, there's English, and there is Swahili, which it's yet to be fully implemented, because at the level of, even within the continent, at the level of some countries, this a universal language is yet to be fully implemented. But then, let's focus on something else. Statistics have shown that to travel, say, abroad within the European Union, or say European member states, or say different countries abroad, it's quite easier, and it's quite easier for those outside the continent to travel within African countries than Africans themselves. What accounts for this? And of course, is this one of the origins of this division which you're seeing? Because in recent times we have these tensions that do exist between African countries. Could we say that these borders could be at the origin of this division?
I think that one of the most difficult things that we are facing on the African continent is the fact that we do not have a lot of competition in the marketplace. So it's so difficult for anyone to break through in most of our countries, especially when it comes to high-stake projects like owning an airline, telecommunication, or other endeavors that will actually bring development in the area. So you have countries that will put very restrictive, stringent, extremely expensive, tariffs and fees on airline companies just to land at the airport. And as a result of that, the fees, that these airlines have to charge will definitely go up because of how much or how expensive it is for us to, or for these planes to land, in foreign territories, especially on the African continent. We call them foreign territories, just next door neighbors. And also when they do travel out of the continent of Africa. I bet that it is cheaper for Air Peace to take anybody out of Nigeria to London than it is for them to fly 45 minutes to an hour away from Lagos to a place like Douala. That is the curse that we have on the African continent, that our own communication within the continent of Africa is quite stunted, extremely expensive. We see this even in telecommunication, as opposed to how cheap and how easy and how flexible it is for someone to leave a place like Lagos and have a weekend in London. I think we have to find ways in which we can improve on the continent of Africa to bring in foreign investors, basically do away with all of these fees, that we are charging. That basically makes no sense. Let there be a free market, and somewhat, as long as we have more people competing, for our money, that means there are more airline companies, the prices will absolutely go down. And the second thing that will emerge also is that there will be great competition, and safety, has been shown to actually improve. So the notion that someone has to spend tremendous amount of money just to live from a place like Accra to South Africa, as opposed to living from Accra to New York, it's something that it's laughable, but that's the reality on the African continent, and we have to make sure that we take care of it.
Yeah, earlier on you said that the problem within the African continent, especially this issue of a borderless Africa, could be regarded from an economic perspective, but I'll be coming back to that. In just in line with your point earlier on, so could we say that there's visa waivers, because we've seen countries like Seychelles, we've seen the Gambia, we've seen Rwanda, Kenya, those countries that have announced visa-free requirements for all Africans. We even saw Namibia recently that had actually halted some European countries because they were offering visa-free requirements or literally easing the visa procedures, but these countries were not reciprocating. Now, within the African continent, while we're advocating for borderless Africa, could these visa waivers, a single currency and a single passport harness this dream of a united and say prosperous continent?
That is actually what is needed. Forget about, the political front where we are trying to be able to erase this border physically. We might never be able to do that, because then those areas will just become, especially when we get into a federal system, those international borders will become state borders. So, which is okay, that's not a problem, just so that we can actually be able to manage resources on the continent of Africa, and it's also going to help us, especially when it comes to issues about elections. Now, the issue is, on the economic front, I think that any country that has any functioning brain cell will know for a fact that once you open up the country for free goods and services and allow people to come in, what that means is you're boosting the local economy. You are actually helping the smaller business owners, the small to medium-sized business owners in those particular countries, and those who are still entering into the job market to have better opportunities to succeed than to fail. The second thing is, I believe that if we are even going to start talking, about having a free and a borderless Africa, we should focus more on the economic front than on the political front. If we have free trade agreements, that would absolutely make tremendous sense. Think about it from the Eastern Bloc, ECOWAS, those guys in the South, basically, trading among themselves freely, and then later on we can now integrate the Western Bloc, the Eastern Bloc, and the Southern Bloc. As well. If that happened, then we've actually achieved a continental free trade area. Now, a common currency is absolutely good so that we don't have to deal with fees and remittance and exchange rate. If you bought something from someone in Ghana and you're in South Africa, you know how much you're paying and the value is the same. So there is no issues about you being quite confused as to how much you have to sell it and what will be the actual amount of money I get once the exchange rate has been taken out. That's why it's extremely quite important for us to manage this, especially when it comes to a common currency. A common currency is something that is a must for us to have on the continent of Africa. And I think that for us to also be able to achieve this, we might take it, block by block. Just as we have the CFA, which is being used by a couple of French African countries, we need to be able to have a framework in most African countries, that mirror image whatever it is that is happening with the CFA, excluding the fact that the currency is being manipulated and controlled by France. If we have those frameworks, we can now be able to push that into the Eastern Bloc, push that into the South African Bloc, and then as a result of that, eventually we can now come together to have one currency without having to pay the price of testing to see if it would actually work. I think this is extremely very important, but the monetary policies and framework in our individual countries must mirror image each other. Otherwise, will be it will be extremely quite difficult when it comes to inflation. It will be very difficult when it comes to us actually getting to know where we are in terms of the value of the currency, even from an international perspective.